The mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected a distorted tableau of avarice. At its head sat Alastair Blackwood, a man whose name was etched onto skyscrapers and whispered in stock exchanges, yet whose face felt like a mask he could no longer remove. He was 78 years old, and the weight of his empire felt heavier than the sum of all its steel and glass. His son Marcus was jabbing a gold pen at a projection on the wall, his voice a low, predatory growl. "It's a hostile takeover, pure and simple. We bleed them dry, absorb their assets, and liquidate the rest. Clean, efficient." Opposite him, Alastair's daughter Catherine sneered. "Clean? Marcus, your idea of clean is leaving a body that can't be identified. This is messy. It'll be a PR nightmare." Alastair looked from his son's hungry eyes to his daughter's cruel mouth, and in that moment he didn't see his children. He saw vultures circling a carcass that wasn't even dead yet. His carcass. He felt a sudden crushing wave of exhaustion, a soul-deep weariness that had nothing to do with age. He pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood on marble was deafeningly loud in the silent room. "I'm done," he said, his voice raspy. Marcus and Catherine froze, their sibling rivalry forgotten. "Done with the quarterly review?" Marcus asked, confused. Alastair looked at the vast window overlooking the city he had built, a city that now felt like a gilded cage. "No," he said, turning to face them, his eyes hollow. "Done with this, with you." And he walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence more profound than any shouting match, and a fortune that had suddenly, irrevocably, lost all meaning. He bypassed his waiting limousine, waving off his bewildered driver, Arthur, with a gesture that brooked no argument. He walked, a ghost in a bespoke suit, melting into the anonymous afternoon crowds. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to be somewhere his name meant nothing. He found himself descending into the cacophony of the subway, a place he hadn't set foot in for half a century. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and unwashed humanity, a stark, almost violent contrast to the filtered, perfumed air of his penthouse office. He fumbled with the automated ticket machine, his hands accustomed to signing billion-dollar contracts, struggling with the simple task of purchasing a single fare. A teenager with neon green hair sighed dramatically behind him and impatiently tapped the screen for him, taking his cash and handing him the ticket with an eye roll. Alastair murmured a thank you that was lost in the roar of an arriving train. He shuffled aboard, carried by the surge of the crowd. The carriage was a press of bodies, a tapestry of 1,000 lives he knew nothing about. Every seat was taken. He gripped a metal pole, his knuckles white. The train lurched forward, and his knees, brittle with age and disuse, almost buckled. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he were watching himself from a great distance. He was an emperor in exile, a king without a kingdom, stripped bare of everything but the bones and flesh that were slowly failing him. The city lights blurred past the grimy window, each one a monument to a life he no longer wanted to lead. He must have looked as wretched as he felt. A young woman sitting nearby, who couldn't have been more than 20, was watching him with a concerned furrow in her brow. She was pale, and looked tired herself, with faint purple smudges under her eyes. She wore a worn-out coat, the kind that had seen too many winters, and clutched a tattered paperback in her lap. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. He saw pity in them, and it was so genuine, so untainted by the transactional sympathy he was used to, that it startled him. She looked away, then seemed to have an internal debate. Finally, with a small resigned sigh, she stood up. "Sir?" she said, her voice quiet but clear over the screech of the wheels. "You can have my seat." Alistair stared at her. It was such a small gesture, an everyday courtesy, yet in the landscape of his current despair, it felt like a seismic event. People didn't give him things. They took, they demanded, they circled. "Thank you, my dear," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "But you look tired yourself." She gave a weak, self-deprecating smile. "I'm used to it. You're not. Please." She insisted, gesturing again to the now empty seat. He sank into it, a wave of gratitude so intense it almost made him dizzy. The simple kindness of this stranger, this girl with tired eyes and a worn-out coat, was a lifeline thrown into the abyss of his self-pity. He watched as she steadied herself against a pole, swaying with the rhythm of the train, and opened her book. For the first time in years, Alistair Blackwood felt a flicker of something he had thought long dead. Hope. The girl's name was Lily. She was reading the same page for the third time, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. Her mind wasn't on the story. It was on the symphony of aches playing across her body. Her shift at the diner had been 14 hours long, a brutal marathon of hauling plates, mopping up spills, and smiling at customers who looked right through her. Now, every muscle screamed in protest. She had coveted that seat on the train, had fantasized about it for the last 2 hours of her shift. Sinking into it had been a moment of pure, unadulterated bliss. Giving it up had felt like severing a limb. But the old man, there was a fragility about him, a lost look in his eyes that had resonated with a deep, instinctual part of her. He looked like her grandfather had looked in his final weeks, when the world had become too loud, too fast, too much. So she had stood, and now her feet were throbbing in her cheap, worn-thin shoes. And the thought of the 40-minute ride ahead, followed by the 20-minute walk to her apartment, was a bleak prospect. She leaned her head against the cool metal of the pole, closing her eyes for just a second, letting the motion of the train rock her. She thought of her mother, probably waiting up for her, a cup of herbal tea ready on the small wobbly kitchen table. The thought was both a comfort and a spur of guilt. She had to keep going. For her mom. The rent was late again. The pharmacy had called to say the prescription refill was ready, another $78 they didn't have. The landlord, Mr. Henderson, had cornered her in the hallway last week, his breath smelling of stale coffee and impatience, reminding her that his charity had its limits. Lily felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the cold knot of anxiety that was her constant companion. She opened her eyes and focused on her book, forcing the words into focus, seeking refuge in a world that wasn't her own. Alistair watched her, his gaze discreet but intense. He saw the faint tremor in her hand as she held the book, the way she subtly shifted her weight from one aching foot to the other. He saw the scuffed toes of her shoes and the careful, neat patch on the elbow of her coat. These were details he had trained himself to ignore, the inconvenient truths of a world he had insulated himself from. His own children wore shoes that cost more than this girl probably earned in a month, and they complained about the fit. He felt a hot flush of shame. He had created a dynasty of takers, of emotional parasites who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. And here, in a rattling metal tube, deep beneath the earth, was a girl who had next to nothing, and yet she had given him her only comfort without a moment's hesitation. He cleared his throat. "That's a good book," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up, her eyes wide. "Oh, yes, it is. I've read it before." "The best ones are worth rereading," he said, offering a small smile. "They're like old friends." She returned the smile, and for a moment the weariness in her face lifted. "I like that. Old friends." They fell into a comfortable silence, the shared observation creating a small, fragile bridge between them. He wanted to ask her name, to ask about her life, but he didn't know how. The muscles of casual conversation had atrophied in him, replaced by the blunt instruments of command and negotiation. How did one talk to a person when you wanted nothing from them but to understand their existence? When the automated voice announced her stop, Lily tucked the book into her bag. "This is me," she said to the old man. "It was nice talking to you." She gave him another small, tired smile. "You have a good night, sir. Rest up." And with that, she was gone, disappearing into the throng of people on the platform. Alistair watched her go, a sense of panic rising in him. He hadn't even asked her name. He didn't know a single thing about her. The doors hissed shut, and the train pulled away, leaving him with nothing but the lingering image of her kind, weary face. He felt a desperate, urgent need to find her, to repay her kindness in some meaningful way. It was more than just a whim. It felt like a mission, a purpose. His life, which had seemed a barren wasteland just an hour ago, now had a single, clear objective. He would find the girl from the train. He stayed on the train for 2 more stops, then got off and hailed a taxi, the first one he had taken in decades. He gave the driver the address of his penthouse, the word feeling alien on his tongue. Back in the sterile opulence of his apartment, he went straight to his office. He buzzed his chief of staff, a man who hadn't received a direct call from Alistair after 7 p.m. in over 15 years. "I need you to find someone," Alistair said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. He described the girl, her approximate age, her worn coat, her tired eyes, the station she got off at. It was a ridiculously vague set of clues. But for the first time in a long, long time, Alistair Blackwood knew exactly what he wanted. And when Alistair Blackwood wanted something, the world had a way of rearranging itself to give it to him. The next few days were a strange purgatory for Lily. She worked, she came home, she cared for her mother, she slept. It was a monotonous cycle of exhaustion and anxiety, each day bleeding into the next. The $78 for the prescription had wiped out their grocery money. They ate canned soup and toast, pretending it was a choice, a craving for simple things. Her mother, Sarah, never complained, but Lily saw the way she pushed the food around her plate, her appetite stolen by illness and worry. Sarah spent most of her days in a worn armchair by the window, a quilt draped over her lap, watching the world go by. Her breathing was often shallow, a faint wheezing sound that was the soundtrack to Lily's life. "You're working too hard, my love," Sarah would say, her voice thin as parchment. "I'm fine, Mom," Lily would lie, massaging her mother's swollen ankles. "The diner's busy. That's a good thing. Means good tips." It was a lie. The tips were terrible. She'd made $7 on her last 14-hour shift. $7, and the lingering smell of grease in her hair. During a rare quiet moment at the diner, she overheard a conversation between two customers, businessmen in sharp suits complaining about the market. They mentioned the name Blackwood Industries, and a cold dread washed over Lily. It was the name her mother sometimes whispered in her sleep, a name tangled up in the family's painful history. It was the company her grandfather, Daniel, had worked for. He had been a master carpenter, a craftsman of the old school, who could make wood sing. He'd been one of their best, her mother always said, until one day he wasn't. He'd been laid off, dismissed with a paltry severance package, and a cloud of shame that had followed him to his early grave. It was the beginning of their family's long, slow slide into poverty. The men in the booth laughed about some corporate drama. Alistair Blackwood, the company's founder, had apparently had some kind of breakdown, walked out of a board meeting and just vanished for a few hours. Probably off on his yacht, one of them chuckled, the pressure getting to the old man. Lily felt a bitter taste in her mouth. The pressure. She thought of the pressure of the rent, of the medical bills, of her mother's failing health. The problems of men like Alistair Blackwood felt like a different species of existence. Meanwhile, Alistair's request had sent a ripple of controlled panic through his organization. His security team, led by a calm, methodical man named Gavin, was used to tracking corporate spies and threats to Alistair's person, not locating an anonymous girl based on a fleeting encounter on public transit. They pulled security footage from the station, cross-referencing it with facial recognition databases. They canvassed the area around the station, showing a grainy screen grab from the CCTV to shopkeepers and street vendors. It was a needle-in-a-haystack operation. Alistair was uncharacteristically impatient, calling Gavin 3 times a day for updates. "She was wearing a gray coat, Gavin, patched on the right elbow. Did you tell your men that? It's important." Gavin, a man who had located missing persons on 3 continents, assured him they had all the details. Arthur, Alistair's longtime driver and confidant, watched the proceedings with a quiet understanding. He had seen his boss's soul shrivel over the years, eaten away by wealth and suspicion. This sudden, obsessive quest, as strange as it was, seemed to have breathed life back into the old man. Alistair was eating better, sleeping less, but with more energy. He had a spark in his eye that Arthur hadn't seen since Mrs. Blackwood was alive. He wasn't just looking for a girl. He was looking for a piece of his own humanity that he'd lost. 3 days into the search, they got a break. A coffee shop owner 2 blocks from the station recognized the girl in the photo. "Yeah, Lily," he said, wiping down his counter. "She comes in sometimes after her shift. Works at the Greasy Spoon down the street, the corner booth. Poor kid, works herself to the bone." The information was relayed to Alistair, who was sitting in his sky-high office, staring out at his kingdom. He felt a surge of triumph that eclipsed any business deal he had ever closed. "The corner booth," he repeated, the name sounding both humble and profound. He told Gavin to stand down. This next part he would do himself. He instructed Arthur to drive him, not in the Rolls-Royce, but in a nondescript sedan from the company fleet. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and slacks, clothes that were still ridiculously expensive, but didn't scream billionaire. As they drove into the part of town where Lily lived and worked, a neighborhood of brick tenements and bodegas, Alistair felt that same sense of dislocation he'd experienced on the train. The buildings were older, The streets were grittier, but there was a vibrancy here, a raw, unfiltered life that was absent from his own manicured world. Arthur pulled up across the street from the corner booth. It was exactly what its name suggested, a small diner, tucked onto a street corner, its sign faded, its windows steamy. Alistair could see her through the glass, a small figure in a pink uniform, her hair tied back in a ponytail. She was balancing a tower of plates on her arm, weaving through the crowded tables with a practiced grace. He watched her for a long time, his heart aching with a strange mix of pity and admiration. She was a warrior, fighting a battle he had never had to imagine. He finally took a deep breath. "All right, Arthur," he said, his voice quiet. "Let's go." Lily was on autopilot. Her feet ached, her back was a knot of tension, and a customer at table 4 had just complained that his coffee was too wet. She was contemplating the physics of too wet coffee when the bell above the door chimed. 2 men walked in. One was a tall, distinguished-looking man, with silver hair and a chauffeur's quiet dignity. The other was the old man from the train. She froze, a coffee pot halfway to a mug. He looked different now. His clothes were simple but exquisitely made, and the lost, frail look in his eyes had been replaced by a calm, focused intensity. He looked powerful. Her mind scrambled to make sense of his presence in her dingy little corner of the world. Had he followed her? Was he some kind of eccentric? Her first instinct was fear, a primal response honed by a life of being a vulnerable woman in a harsh world. He walked towards her, his eyes kind. "Hello again," he said, his voice the same gentle rumble she remembered. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Lily just stared, dumbfounded. "You? You're the man from the train," she stammered, feeling foolishly obvious. "I am," he said. "My name is Alistair." He didn't offer a last name. "I never got a chance to properly thank you for your kindness the other day. It meant a great deal to me." The diner's owner, a portly man named Sal, waddled over, wiping his hands on his apron. "Everything all right here, Lily?" he asked, eyeing Alistair with suspicion. "Yes, Sal, I know this gentleman," she said, though the words felt untrue. She didn't know him at all. "I was hoping," Alistair continued, his focus entirely on her, "that you might allow me to repay you. Perhaps I could buy you lunch when you're finished with your shift." Lily's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. People like him didn't just show up in places like this. There was always an angle, always a catch. "Sir, that's very kind, but it's not necessary," she said, her voice more formal now. "It was just a seat on a train. I didn't do anything." "You did more than you know," he said softly. "Please, I insist. I'm not a threat, I promise you. This is my driver, Arthur. He'll wait with me." He gestured to the tall man, who gave Lily a respectful nod. Something in their demeanor, a quiet sincerity, began to chip away at her defenses. And besides, she was hungry. She hadn't had a proper meal in days. "My shift ends in an hour," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "We'll wait." They took a booth in the corner, and Alistair ordered a black coffee, which he didn't touch. He simply sat, watching the life of the diner, a silent observer in a world he had forgotten existed. Lily tried to go about her work, but she was acutely aware of his presence. She felt his eyes on her as she refilled salt shakers and wiped down counters. The hour crawled by. When her replacement finally arrived, Lily untied her apron with trembling hands. She felt a nervous flutter in her stomach. What was she doing? She walked over to their booth, smoothing down her worn jeans. "Okay," she said. "I'm ready." Alistair stood. "Where would you like to go?" "Anywhere you want." Lily hesitated. The only restaurants she knew were fast food chains in places like this. She couldn't imagine sitting in a fancy restaurant with this man. "There's a little Italian place a few blocks from here," she suggested. "It's quiet and cheap." He just smiled. "It sounds perfect." The walk to the restaurant was surreal. Alistair walked slowly, accommodating her tired pace, asking gentle questions about the neighborhood. She found herself telling him about Mrs. Gable's flower boxes and the stray cat everyone called Patches. It felt strangely normal, like talking to a grandfather she'd never had. The restaurant was a tiny family-run place with checkered tablecloths and Chianti bottles holding dripping candles. The owner, Mama Rosie, greeted Lily with a hug and a pinch on the cheek before seating them. Over plates of spaghetti and meatballs, Alistair finally began to explain. "I wasn't entirely truthful with you," he began, setting down his fork. "My name is Alistair Blackwood." Lily's fork clattered onto her plate. Blackwood. The name from the business news. The name whispered in her mother's nightmares. The man responsible for her family's ruin. She stared at him, her blood running cold. The kindness in his eyes now seemed like a cruel deception. "Blackwood Industries?" she asked, her voice shaking. He nodded slowly, his expression pained. "Yes, I imagine you've heard of me." Heard of him? Her entire life had been shaped by the aftershocks of his company's decisions. The poverty, the struggle, her mother's illness, exacerbated by stress and lack of proper care. It all traced back to a decision made in one of his sterile boardrooms decades ago. "My grandfather," she said, her voice low and brittle with fury. "Daniel Gable. He worked for you. He was a carpenter." Alistair's face went pale. The name clearly meant nothing to him. He was a god so high up in his corporate heaven that the names of the mortals who toiled for him were less than dust. The realization was more insulting than any malice. "He was laid off," she continued, the words spilling out, hot with years of repressed anger. "After 20 years of loyal service. They said it was restructuring. They threw him away like an old tool. It destroyed him. It destroyed my family." Alistair sat in stunned silence, the weight of her words landing like physical blows. He had no memory of a carpenter named Daniel Gable. In a company of thousands, how could he? But he had no doubt her story was true. He had overseen dozens of restructurings, signed off on thousands of layoffs. They were just numbers on a page. Efficiency metrics. Strategic realignments. He had never allowed himself to think of them as people, as families, as lives irrevocably altered. He had insulated himself from the human cost of his empire. And now that cost was sitting across from him, her eyes shining with tears of righteous anger. I am so sorry," he said, the words feeling utterly, pathetically inadequate. "I had no idea. Your act of kindness to me on the train. And all the while, my actions, my company's actions, had caused your family such pain. The irony is staggering." Lily said nothing. She just looked at him, her heart a tangled mess of fury, grief, and a strange, unwilling flicker of pity for the lost old man she now saw before her. "I want to make it right," he said, his voice urgent, desperate. "I know I can't undo the past, but I can change the future. For you, for your mother." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Let me help you, Lily. Let me pay for your mother's medical care. All of it. The best doctors, the best treatments. Let me give you a job, a real one, with a future. Not as charity, as a form of restitution, atonement. Lily felt her head spin. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Her mother healthy, a life free from the constant, grinding anxiety of poverty. But it was being offered by the very man who had plunged her family into that darkness. It felt like a deal with the devil. Could she take his money, knowing it was built on the foundations of her family's suffering? But then she thought of her mother's wheezing breath, of the eviction notice she knew was coming. What choice did she really have? Her pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She looked at Alistair Blackwood, at the deep, genuine remorse etched into the lines on his face. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man, a flawed, regretful man, trying to undo a lifetime of willful ignorance. "Okay," she whispered, the word tasting like both surrender and victory. "Okay." The next few days were a blur. True to his word, Alistair moved with the speed and efficiency of a man used to commanding armies. Within 24 hours, a team of the city's top specialists had reviewed Sarah's medical files. Within 48, she was admitted to a private suite at the city's best hospital, a room with a view of a serene garden instead of their tenement's grimy air shaft. The doctors were kind, attentive, and spoke of treatment plans and prognoses with a confidence that Lily had never heard before. They discovered a complication with her medication, a simple adjustment that her previous overworked clinic doctor had missed, an error that had been slowly making her sicker. With the new regimen, the change in her mother was almost immediate. The color returned to her cheeks. Her breathing eased. The persistent fog of fatigue began to lift. Sarah was overwhelmed, disoriented by the sudden luxurious turn her life had taken. "Lily, this is too much," she'd whisper, her hand lost in Lily's as they sat by the hospital window. "How can we ever repay this?" Lily didn't know how to answer. She hadn't told her mother the full story yet, only that she had met a kind, wealthy man who had offered to help. She couldn't bring herself to say the name Blackwood. Not yet. Alistair also arranged for them to move. He had a portfolio of properties across the city, and he offered her a small, beautifully furnished apartment in a quiet, safe building with a doorman. It was in one of his older buildings, he explained, with character. It had hardwood floors, a modern kitchen, and a small balcony overflowing with potted geraniums. When Lily walked into it for the first time, she burst into tears. It was the first time she had cried, not from despair, but from relief. The crushing weight she had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. She could breathe. But the relief was tinged with a disquieting sense of obligation. She was now living in Alistair Blackwood's world, under his protection. She had a new job, too. He had created a position for her in his personal office as an administrative assistant. Her desk was in an anteroom to his own vast office on the top floor of the Blackwood Tower. The job was, for the moment, mostly symbolic. Her main task was to learn, to observe. He gave her financial reports to read, market analyses, project proposals. He would call her in at the end of the day and ask for her thoughts. "Don't tell me what you think I want to hear," he'd say. "Tell me what you really think. What would your grandfather have thought of this venture? Was it honorable? Was it fair to the workers?" At first, she was intimidated, terrified of saying the wrong thing. But she soon realized he was serious. He wasn't looking for a sycophant. He was looking for a conscience. He was using her as his moral compass, a way to recalibrate his own tarnished sense of right and wrong. Her presence in the executive suite did not go unnoticed. News of the mysterious new girl, who had the ear of the old man, spread through the company like wildfire. But nowhere was her arrival felt more acutely than with Alastair's own children. Marcus and Catherine were summoned to their father's office a week after Lily started. They found her sitting at her new desk, organizing files. They looked at her as if she were a piece of gum they had found on their shoe. When they entered the main office, Alastair was blunt. "Lily Gable will be working with me from now on," he announced without preamble. "I expect you to treat her with respect and courtesy." Marcus forced a tight, predatory smile. "Of course, Father. We're always happy to welcome new talent. Though her qualifications are unconventional, aren't they?" Catherine was more direct. "What is this, Father? Some new charitable project? Did you find a stray and decide to bring her home?" Alastair's eyes turned to ice. "This is not a charity case. This is a business decision. Lily has a perspective that has been sorely lacking in this company and in this family. A perspective I now find invaluable." The message was clear. Lily was under his protection. But this only served to galvanize his children's suspicion and resentment. They saw Lily not as a person, but as a threat, a gold-digging interloper who had somehow sunk her claws into their aging, increasingly erratic father. Their inheritance, the empire they had been raised to believe was their birthright, suddenly seemed vulnerable, and they would do anything to protect it. The battle lines had been drawn. Lily, who had only ever wanted a life of quiet security for her and her mother, found herself standing in the center of a silent, vicious war she was utterly unprepared to fight. The following weeks fell into a strange and precarious rhythm. By day, Lily navigated the treacherous currents of Blackwood Tower. The executive floor was a world of hushed whispers, expensive perfume, and thinly veiled ambition. People were either coldly polite to her or sickeningly sycophantic, trying to use her as a conduit to her father. She learned to smile, to be pleasant, but to trust no one. Marcus would often stop by her desk, his presence a suffocating wave of cologne and condescension. He'd ask her about her work, his questions dripping with insinuation, designed to trip her up and expose her ignorance. "So, Lily, what's your take on the arbitrage opportunities in the Far East commodities market?" he'd ask with a smirk, knowing full well she had no idea what he was talking about. She learned to respond with a calm, "I'm still getting up to speed on that, Marcus. I'll be sure to read the latest report." She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Catherine's attacks were more subtle. She would accidentally leave out Lily's name from meeting invitations, or forget to forward her crucial emails. Small acts of sabotage designed to isolate her and make her look incompetent. Lily learned to be meticulous, to double-check everything, to anticipate their machinations. It was exhausting, a constant game of psychological chess. Her true education, however, took place in the quiet hours of the late afternoon in Alastair's office. He treated her like a student, a protégé. He would spread blueprints and financial models across his vast desk and walk her through them, explaining the intricate dance of capital, logistics, and human resources. He wasn't just teaching her how to run a business. He was showing her the soul of his empire. He showed her pictures of the first workshop he'd ever opened, a small, dusty garage. He told her about the men who had worked with him then, men whose names he still remembered, men like her grandfather. "We built things with our hands, Lily," he'd say, his voice thick with nostalgia. "We cared about the quality, the craftsmanship. It was about more than just profit." He was, she realized, trying to reconnect with the young, idealistic man he had once been. In teaching her, he was reteaching himself. Lily, in turn, began to see the man behind the fearsome corporate titan. She saw his loneliness, the profound disappointment he felt in his own children, and his desperate, clawing search for redemption. The anger she had felt towards him began to soften, replaced by a complex, guarded affection. He was a flawed, difficult man, but he was trying. In a world of predators, his effort to reclaim his soul felt like a heroic act. Evenings were her sanctuary. She would go to the hospital to sit with her mother. Sarah was thriving under proper care. The doctors had started her on a course of physical therapy, and she was regaining her strength. For the first time in years, they talked about the future. They talked about taking a trip to the seaside, about planting a garden on their new balcony. The shadow of death that had loomed over them for so long was finally receding. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as Lily was brushing her mother's hair, that she finally found the courage to tell her the whole truth. She told her about the train, about the old man, and finally she spoke his name, Alistair Blackwood. Sarah went very still, the hairbrush halting in midair. She looked at her daughter's reflection in the window, her expression unreadable. Lily braced herself for an outburst of anger, for a repetition of the fury she herself had felt in the Italian restaurant. But it didn't come. Sarah was silent for a long time, watching the city lights flicker to life. "Your grandfather," Sarah said at last, her voice soft and distant. "He never hated Mr. Blackwood. He was a craftsman. He respected another man who built things. The ones he hated were the little men, the accountants and managers who came later. The ones who didn't know the difference between the grain of oak and the grain of pine, but who knew how to turn a man's life into a number on a spreadsheet." She turned to look at Lily, her eyes clear and perceptive. "This man, Alistair Blackwood, is he one of the builders, or is he one of the accountants?" Lily thought for a moment, picturing Alistair poring over blueprints, his old hands tracing the lines of a new design. "He was a builder," she said, "and I think he's trying to be a builder again." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then you must be careful, my love. A man at war with himself can be a dangerous ally." Her mother's words were prophetic. Marcus and Catherine, frustrated by their father's unshakable defense of Lily, escalated their campaign. They hired a private investigator, a slick, amoral man named Fletcher, with instructions to dig up any dirt he could find on Lily Gable. "I want to know everything," Marcus instructed him in a hushed meeting in a private club. "Every job she's ever had, every friend, every late rent payment. I want to know what she had for breakfast a decade ago. Find something we can use to discredit her. I want her gone." Fletcher was good at his job. He was a human mole, burrowing into the past, unearthing secrets people thought were long buried. He started with Lily's grandfather, Daniel. He pulled old employment records from Blackwood Industries, interviewed former employees, delved into dusty town archives. He expected to find a story of incompetence or petty crime, something to justify the dismissal. But he found the opposite. Daniel Gable was universally remembered as a man of immense skill and unimpeachable integrity. A quiet, proud man who kept to himself and did his work to perfection. The official reason for his termination was redundancy during corporate restructuring. It was a dead end. But Fletcher was persistent. He kept digging, cross-referencing timelines, talking to one more retired foreman, one more disgruntled ex-manager. And then he found it. A small crack in the official story, a discrepancy, a secret that had been buried for 30 years. He picked up the phone to call Marcus, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. He had found the weapon they were looking for. He had found the story that would not just destroy Lily Gable, but might also destroy Alistair Blackwood himself. The confrontation, when it came, was sudden and brutal. Alistair had called a family meeting in the formal living room of his penthouse. A cold, museum-like space they rarely used. He had an announcement to make. Lily was there, standing slightly behind his chair, a position that infuriated Marcus and Catherine. "As you know," Alistair began, his voice firm, "I've been re-evaluating the company's direction, its soul, and I've decided to make a change. I'm establishing a new charitable foundation, the Blackwood Guild, dedicated to supporting artisans and craftsmen, and providing educational grants to a new generation of builders. It will be funded by a significant portion of my personal shares." Marcus and Catherine exchanged a look of pure fury. This was their inheritance he was giving away. "And who, might I ask," Catherine said, her voice dripping with venom, "will be running this new guild?" Alistair smiled. "I'm glad you asked. I'm appointing Lily as its first executive director." It was a declaration of war. Marcus slammed his hand down on a delicate antique table, making a vase jump. "This has gone far enough. Father, you have to see what she is. She's a parasite, a con artist who has manipulated you." "That's enough, Marcus," Alistair thundered. "You will not speak about her that way." "Oh, we're just getting started," Marcus sneered, pulling a leather-bound folder from his briefcase and tossing it onto the coffee table. "We did some digging, Father, on your little project, on her sainted grandfather." He opened the folder. Inside were photocopied documents, sworn affidavits, a meticulously constructed narrative of deceit. It turns out Daniel Gable wasn't just laid off. He was a troublemaker. More than that, he was a thief. He was caught stealing high-grade lumber, specialty tools. The company was going to press charges, but the manager at the time, a man named Henderson, took pity on him. He let him resign quietly to avoid a scandal. It's all here. Your precious Lily comes from a family of criminals. This whole thing, her showing up on that train, it's all been a long con, a scheme to get revenge and extort money from the company that rightfully fired her thieving grandfather. Lily felt the blood drain from her face. The words hit her like stones. A thief? Her grandfather? The man who had taught her that a person's integrity was the only thing they truly owned? It was an obscene lie. "That's not true!" she cried, her voice trembling. "My grandfather was an honest man." "The evidence says otherwise," Catherine said coolly, gesturing to the folder. Alistair looked from his children's triumphant, hateful faces to Lily's pale, devastated one. He looked at the folder, but didn't touch it. Something was wrong. The story was too neat, too perfect. He knew his son. Marcus wasn't a detective. He was a butcher. This felt constructed. He turned his gaze to Lily and saw not the cunning of a con artist, but the deep, soul-crushing pain of a person whose family honor had just been desecrated. And in that moment, he made a choice. He chose to trust the girl from the train. "I don't believe you," he said quietly to Marcus. "This is a lie." "It's all there in the report, Father. Read it." "I don't need to read your pack of lies," Alistair said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm going to find the truth." He stood up, his old frame imbued with a sudden formidable strength. "This meeting is over. Get out of my house, both of you." Marcus and Catherine stared at him, aghast. They had played their trump card, and it had failed. Their father had chosen this nobody, over them, over their evidence. As they stormed out, their faces masks of pure hatred, Alistair walked over to Lily, who was now openly weeping. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't you worry, my dear," he said, his voice a low, determined rumble. "We are going to uncover the truth, and we will bring it into the light." He looked down at the folder Marcus had left behind, a testament to his children's treachery. He knew this wasn't just about Lily anymore. This was about the soul of his company, the legacy of his name, and a 30-year-old secret that refused to stay buried. Alistair became a man possessed. He turned the full, formidable resources of his office towards a single goal: uncovering what truly happened to Daniel Gable. He didn't trust the documents Marcus had produced. They were tainted, filtered through his son's malice. He wanted the raw data, the original files. He dispatched his own trusted internal auditors, a team of forensic accountants and researchers, to the company's deep archives, a climate-controlled cavern of paper and microfilm where the corporation's history was interred. He wanted every memo, every expense report, every personnel file related to the woodworking division from 30 years ago. He wanted to find the manager Marcus had mentioned, Henderson. Meanwhile, he tried to comfort Lily, who had retreated into a state of shocked grief. The accusation against her grandfather had struck at the very core of her identity. "He made me a small wooden bird when I was 6, she told Alistair, her voice choked with tears as they sat in his quiet study. "He spent a week on it, carving every feather. He told me, 'Lily, never be careless with your work or your word. They are the only two things that are truly yours.' He wasn't a thief. I know he wasn't." Alistair listened, his heart aching for her. He saw in her story the echo of his own past, of the values he had once held dear and had slowly compromised over the years in the name of growth and profit. Vindicating Daniel Gable had become synonymous with vindicating himself. The break came 3 days later. The auditors found him, Henderson, the manager. He was retired, living in a quiet suburb, 2 hours outside the city. Arthur drove Alistair and Lily there himself. They found Henderson tending roses in his small, neat garden. He was an old man now, stooped and weathered, but his eyes were still sharp. When he saw Alistair Blackwood walking up his driveway, all the color drained from his face. He knew this day would come. He had been dreading it for 30 years. They sat in his small, cluttered living room, the air thick with the smell of dust and regret. At first, Henderson stuck to the official story, the one Marcus's investigator had uncovered. Yes, Gable was a problem. Yes, there were suspicions of theft. But under Alistair's calm, relentless questioning, the facade began to crumble. "There was no theft, was there, Mr. Henderson?" Alistair asked, his voice soft but unyielding. Henderson's composure finally broke. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "No," he admitted, his voice muffled. "There was no theft. Daniel Gable was the most honest man I ever knew." The true story, when it finally emerged, was far uglier and more damning than simple theft. Daniel, Henderson explained, had discovered a problem. The company had landed a major contract to provide custom millwork for a luxury hotel development. To cut costs and increase the profit margin, a senior executive from head office had ordered the use of a cheaper, substandard fire retardant treatment for the wood. It was a violation of the building code, a dangerous, potentially lethal shortcut. Daniel, with his intimate knowledge of the materials, was the first to notice. He knew it was wrong. He went to Henderson, his foreman, expecting him to be outraged. Henderson was, but he was also terrified. The executive who had given the order was a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless rising star in the company, a man known for crushing anyone who got in his way, a man named Marcus Blackwood. "He was just a vice president then," Henderson whispered, his eyes wide with the memory. "But everyone knew he was the future. He was the boss's son. What were we supposed to do?" Daniel wouldn't let it go. He said he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent. He was going to go over my head, go to corporate ethics, go to you. Marcus, Henderson explained, got wind of Daniel's intentions. He came down to the workshop himself. There was no shouting, no overt threats. Just a cold, quiet conversation in Henderson's office. Marcus had made it clear, if this story got out, it wouldn't just be Daniel Gable who was finished. Henderson's career would be over. The entire division might be shut down. Marcus had offered a solution, a way for everyone to walk away. They would create a story, a reason for Gable's dismissal, a quiet, reputation-destroying lie. Henderson, terrified for his job, his pension, his family, had agreed. They framed Daniel Gable, planting the evidence of theft and forcing him to resign in shame. Lily listened to this confession, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. A wave of ice-cold fury washed over her, so intense it left her breathless. Her grandfather hadn't been a thief. He had been a hero, a whistleblower, silenced and destroyed by the greed and cowardice of lesser men. And the man responsible, the architect of her family's decades of suffering, was Marcus, Alistair's son. Alistair sat like a statue carved from stone, his face a mask of utter devastation. The story was a dagger in his heart. It wasn't just that his company had committed a grievous wrong. It was that his own son, his own flesh and blood, was the source of the rot. The ambition he had fostered in Marcus, the killer instinct he had rewarded, had metastasized into a cancer of corruption and cruelty. He had not just created a successful businessman. He had created a monster. He looked at Lily, at the righteous fire in her eyes, and then at the broken, weeping old man in the armchair. He felt the full crushing weight of his legacy. He had built an empire on a foundation of compromised values, and now the chickens had come home to roost. The drive back to the city was silent, thick with unspoken grief and rage. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Alistair went straight to his desk. He picked up the phone and spoke 2 words to his secretary. "Get Marcus." Marcus arrived an hour later, striding into the penthouse with his usual arrogant swagger. He saw Lily standing by the window and sneered. "Still here? I'm surprised. I figured you'd have packed your bags and run after we exposed your family's dirty laundry." "It was a lie, Marcus." Alistair said, his voice dangerously calm. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to his son. Every word of it. Marcus's smirk faltered. What are you talking about? It's all documented. We spoke to Mr. Henderson, Alistair said, turning slowly to face him. His eyes were like chips of granite. He told us everything. About the fire retardant. About the hotel contract. About how you framed an honest man to cover up your own criminal negligence. The blood drained from Marcus's face. He was speechless, his mind racing, searching for an escape route, a denial, a new lie. But there was none. He saw in his father's eyes that the game was over. He was a nobody, Marcus finally sputtered, his voice rising in panic. A carpenter. He was going to jeopardize a $50 million deal over some bureaucratic nonsense. I did what I had to do. For the company. For you. You did it for yourself, Alistair said, his voice like the crack of a whip. You did it because you have no honor. You have no integrity. You have my name, but you have none of the values upon which I built this company. He walked over to his desk, his movements slow and deliberate. You are no longer my son. You are no longer an officer of this corporation. You are no longer a beneficiary of my estate. You are nothing to me. Security will escort you from the building. Your personal effects will be sent to you. Now get out of my sight. It was a corporate execution, delivered with the cold, final precision of a surgeon. Marcus stared at his father, his face a twisted mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. He opened his mouth to argue, to plead, to threaten, but no words came out. He looked at Lily, his eyes filled with a hatred so profound it was terrifying. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, out of the company, out of the family. The door closed behind him, leaving a silence that was heavy and absolute. The war was over, and in the ruins, Alistair and Lily were left to figure out what to build next. In the aftermath of the storm, a profound quiet settled over their lives. The expulsion of Marcus sent shockwaves through the company and the city's elite, but Alistair was resolute. Catherine, seeing the utter finality of her brother's fate, and terrified of suffering the same, made a clumsy, self-serving attempt at an apology. Alistair dismissed her with a wave of his hand, cutting her out of his life and business with the same surgical precision. He was a man cleansing his own house. His focus now was entirely on making amends. His first act was a formal, public one. He took out full-page ads in every major newspaper. It was a letter, penned by him, titled, An Apology to Daniel Gable. In it, he laid out the entire story. The cover-up, the framing of an innocent man, and the company's 30-year failure to do right by him. He announced the formation of the Daniel Gable Guild for Artisanal Integrity, endowing it with a staggering $1 billion. Its mission was to support craftsmen, fund ethical businesses, and provide legal protection for whistleblowers. He named Lily as its president, giving her full autonomy to run it as she saw fit. His second act was a private one. He went with Lily to the hospital to see Sarah. He stood before her, not as a billionaire, but as a humbled old man. He apologized, his voice thick with emotion, for the pain his family and his company had inflicted upon hers. Sarah, her strength now returned, looked at him with a clear, steady gaze. "My husband is gone, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice not unkind, "and my daughter has spent her life carrying a burden that should never have been hers. Your money can't buy back that time, but an honest apology, that has value. For Lily's sake, I accept it." Lily poured herself into her new role. She had a purpose now, a mission that resonated with the deepest parts of her soul. She set up the Guild's headquarters, not in a gleaming corporate tower, but in a beautifully restored old brick warehouse in a revitalized industrial district. She sought out artists, woodworkers, weavers, and glassblowers, people who worked with their hands and their hearts, people like her grandfather. She established grants, created apprenticeship programs, and built a community. She was a natural leader, her innate empathy and quiet determination earning her the respect and loyalty of everyone she worked with. She blossomed, the tired, anxious girl from the diner, transformed into a confident, compassionate woman who was changing the world in her own small, meaningful way. Alistair watched her from a distance, his heart swelling with a pride he had never felt for his own children. She was more his heir than they had ever been, an heir not of his blood, but of his redeemed spirit. He found a quiet joy in his final years. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the company, appointing a new CEO with a strong ethical mandate. He spent his afternoons at the Guild's headquarters, sitting in the workshop, watching the artisans at work, the smell of sawdust and turpentine, reminding him of the young man he had once been. He and Lily would often have lunch, not in fancy restaurants, but in the small bustling cafe at the Guild. Their bond was deep and unspoken, a quiet friendship forged in the crucible of truth and forgiveness. One sunny afternoon, about a year later, Lily found Alistair sitting on a bench in the park across from the Guild. He looked frail, but his eyes were bright and peaceful. "I was thinking about the train," he said as she sat down beside him. "It's funny, I got on that train to become invisible, to escape being Alistair Blackwood. And instead, I found the one person in the world who could show me what that name was supposed to mean." Lily smiled, laying her hand on his old, wrinkled one. "You were just a tired old man who needed a seat," she said softly. "And I was just a tired young woman who had one to give." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. In the distance, the Blackwood Tower scraped the sky, a monument of glass and steel. But here, on this simple park bench, surrounded by the sounds of children laughing and leaves rustling, was where his true legacy resided. It wasn't in the buildings or the balance sheets. It was in the quiet dignity of a good man's name restored, and in the simple, profound power of an unexpected kindness. If this story of compassion, redemption, and the surprising turns of life has touched your heart, please consider sharing it with others. A small act of kindness, like giving up a seat on a train, can ripple outwards in ways we can never predict. Let's spread stories that remind us of the better angels of our nature and the extraordinary power of ordinary people to change the world. Thank you for reading